Hello, welcome. Jerry Hoffman, Rick Buchanan, to the April issue of Emergency Medical Abstracts, coming to you from a little different venue here. We have gone upstairs
In your house.
in the house, and because Ricky wanted to do a little something different, and it's nice, a little different than where we were.
The fifth floor, is it, or the sixth?
I was going to do the same thing. Yeah, we're on the fourth floor.
This is you get a view of Pasadena from here. The other side, if you take the train over to the other wing of the house, you get a view of
the tram.
San
We don't
Gabriel.
call it the tram. We call it a tram. You can see out here, it's a beautiful day in Southern California. Beautiful.
What you
Spring
can
is
see
here.
is that we're in this gorgeous guest bedroom where I've stayed a couple of times over the years, and which otherwise almost never gets used.
Exactly.
And it's huge and it's beautiful and it's got all the light. Rick stays right below here. That's where he lives, Rick and Diane, and it's also a massive, lovely room, except that it's dark. This room's
Yes,
got all